Welcome to Insight, today produced in partnership with KCOS 13 El Paso Public Television. Today we are chatting with Xochitl Rodriguez, Executive Director and Co-Founder, and Randy Maguire, Director of Programming and a Fellow at the Caldo Collective. Xochitl and Randy have generously agreed to share some of their experience with us. I'd like to thank you both for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So art. Talk about art. Talk about the Caldo Collective.
We started our Caldo Journey about 4 years ago now. It started around a table with a few friends that had recently sort of traveled and come back, or who had stayed in El Paso and were feeling frustrated with a few things, right? The lack of opportunities for artists, more specifically the lack of funding opportunities, but also opportunities to share work and to create spaces where work could be made together with the community. Sort of to answer those needs, we started thinking concretely about how to create an organization that could address those needs. Another big thing that we were looking at was the role of community in art. So we wanted to make sure that we addressed what artists were expressing they needed, but we also wanted to be sure that we looked at what the community could experience if we successfully created more opportunities for artists.
So you have artists around a table. Mm-hmm. Artists are not known for necessarily being financially prosperous, so money is always going to be an issue.
We're so broke. Yeah.
And engaging community requires outreach, and artists want to do their art. They don't want to put together the funding as much. They don't want to spend their time in promoting. How did this whole thing come together so that you created a hospitable environment for art to actually take place, to be created, and then to be shared?
Yeah, so I think it's still, we're still working.
It's still a work in progress.
But we sort of went at it through two broader channels. The first one was answering the question of, okay, there's no money, so how do we find that money? And since we're dealing with art with a capital A, we didn't necessarily want to begin by, applying for grants or seeking funding from existing organizations, that had the buku bucks. Instead, we wanted to try to tackle both sides of the equation by finding the money, but also creating a relationship with the community in doing that. So taking the lead actually from Project Incubate, who's out of Chicago, we started doing Sunday soups, only we had to and have to always put a spin on everything we do that makes sure it's relevant in our crazy, unique community.
So Sunday Soups is what?
Sunday Soups is a series of public feasts that bring the public in to listen to artists and their ideas. They provide a donation at the door. They're fed a really good bowl of soup. And at the end of the feast, all that money's put in a pot, and the guests get to vote on their favorite idea.
So there's an earned income piece, there's a community building piece, there's a interactive, let's talk about art
some dialogue
piece.
And of course there's also the important piece of ownership, which I think we've not really broached on quite a bit, but it is there, and it is a loud part of the puzzle. The idea being that when a community invests in an artist and their work, they also take some ownership in that project and get to have their voice play out in the work. That was that's a big part of what we're still working on, figuring out how to do most effectively. But
so that how do you experience that as an artist? Because if you're participating in one of these Sunday Soups, and all of a sudden people are critiquing your ideas, they're not necessarily buying it. They don't necessarily get it. I know that you've never had this type of an experience before, but
actually, my initial experience with the Caldo Collective, I came in and I was a presenter at one of the feasts, and I pitched my idea. And it's funny that you should say that, because that is something that's always kind of the challenge. I think at first, if you're trying to do things that are different, it's not always very easy to explain or kind of communicate the idea to other people. And really, I think that actually my experience in presenting and trying to think about how the public was going to react to that idea really helped me to kind of bring that particular project to fruition.
So who participates in the collective, and how do you gain participation?
So there's a few ways. The feasts are administered through calls. So we put a call out, and we also have a nomination process. So if an artist wants to participate in a feast and try to go after that funding, they can apply, or they can, connect themselves well and be nominated by one of the jurors. The invitation process for those feasts, I was mentioning that we shifted our approach to it a little bit. We actually have the feasts in people's backyards, much like we all grew up doing. We just throw a party in a backyard, and for my family, we always ate beans and rice, and that was like, we had a party with beans, rice, and horchata. So that's why we're called the Caldo Collective. It's a bowl of caldo together that we share. And in that way, we also really effectively have managed to reach beyond our network to, we now have had 11 feasts, something like that. 11 other people and their massive networks. And we have 100 people attend each feast. So if you do the math on that, that's an incredible number of people that we would never have engaged otherwise. So we have, of course, the artists who access the process this way, and then our amazing community hosts access the process and give people access that way.
So talk about the public art that has been created through this process.
So sort of the main pillar that we've rested all this work on is the idea of access. Access to participation in the arts, access to actually being able to view art, access to the spaces that create art for artists. So it's a two-way interaction that we're looking for. We want to give the public access to the artists, but in El Paso, we also want to make sure that the artists are able to access the public. So our very first inaugural public art project was in an alleyway in a neighborhood called Manhattan Heights. It's one of the historic neighborhoods in the city, located sort of in central El Paso. And we took over the alley and created sort of 3 performance-type stations.
And this requires a considerable effort. You have to get city authority, you have to have neighborhood support.
Yeah, that was
If you
the
don't have
first
neighborhood
step.
support, you can forget the whole thing.
Yeah,
Then you have to have
the permitting.
the permitting.
Yeah,
Then, once the permitting is done, you need site prep.
absolutely.
And then you have the installation process. You have the security during the installation, and then afterwards, if you have to remove, then that has to be done as well. So there's a
Absolutely.
considerable effort. There's a whole arc of activity that you're administering.
Yeah, it's it's a lot of coordination. Probably more coordination on that weekend than art making, it feels like.
So the interesting thing about this kind of event, particularly a first event, is that if it doesn't work,
It's okay.
it's okay, but it's tougher to do it a second time.
Yeah.
So the first time you had people experience it. How many people actually experienced it? What was that? What were those days or that day like for the public, and how many people actually were able to experience the works?
We probably had more than 100 people come through. It was 2 hours. It was a little frantic, and we were worried because there was a storm coming. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
And we had a lot of technology. And all of our wiring came from homes. So like,
Right. So you got
we had like electrical cords coming over walls. So there was that element that was sort of really nerve-wracking. A lot of people who we knew were coming were text messaging like, oh my God, is it really going to happen? Are you still doing it? And we're crazy enough to just, keep charging for it no matter what. But I think the most striking thing, Randy might be able to say more than I can because I was actually performing. I was very tired and in it. As a performer, I was trying to ask people to enter the environment with me and to interact with the projections and to interact with the very simple installation, to experience the sensors that were changing the environment as I moved. And there was so much hesitation to make that happen. And I've performed in other places. Kansas City probably is the main one where that interaction didn't feel so difficult to pull or to inspire.
What did you do it at the what is it, the power plant?
I had a residency with the Charlotte Street Foundation, so
Okay.
I did a few different projects.
Well, the Charlotte
as a
Street
part of that.
Foundation also has a whole.
Spaces.
Well, it has space. It also has a long history of doing these kinds of things. So
Yeah.
people are more accustomed to it.
Absolutely.
But this was the first one that you had done
was
here.
no man's land.
People were they were a little bit hesitant.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah, it was, and that was one of the things that we definitely had at the forefront of our minds when we went on to the next iteration of that project. How can we encourage the audience to really interact with this and really engage with it in ways that maybe they're not expecting?
You are actually providing an exhibition context. It's different than a building with walls in it, but it is still an exhibition context, and it's also cross-disciplinary.
Yeah.
Talk about what you can do in contrast to a traditional museum with that sort of building context.
The first thing that comes to mind after the first year of that public art programming, where we were sort of dealing with that poem, Randy and I had to have a hard talk about the failures of that year, right? We had some great success, but we could also see really clearly the ways in which we had failed. And I think one of the biggest ways that we had failed for us was we had work that engaged the public after it was made. We did not have work that engaged the public to be made. So then we set out the following year for a project called Route Work, and we took to the bus lines and we rode the El Paso Sun Metro for many hours over the course of many months from its point of origin directly on the border in downtown El Paso, literally a block away from the port of entry there. From there, we rode all the way to the end of, I think, 5 different lines repeatedly to reach people who have to some degree been forgotten or go unnoticed on a daily basis.
Did you talk with them? What did
Absolutely.
When you say so, you talked with them. What were you talking to them? Were you soliciting their opinions, or were you talking about their experiences?
Their experiences, their stories, where they were coming from, where they were going.
And what did you do with that information that you
Let
received?
Randy talk about that because
Well, that was, it all culminated in a final exhibition also that was a choreographed, piece along with film that we shot, on the bus lines, and sound and music that was, included material that we recorded while we were actually on those trips.
a lot of field material that we gathered, photos, video, yeah.
And I think the main thing that we wanted, as kind of the months of going through this process, we thought just the best thing that we could do would be to just show that, even in, everyday experiences, there is something beautiful and there's something important and valuable. Even in those experiences that might seem, mundane on the bus, there's something still important happening there.
Xochitl Rodriguez,
Yes.
Brandy Maguire, thank you so much for sharing the work of the Caldo Collective with us, and thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.